has a chair for cultural theory, cultural analysis at the Zeppelin University at Friedrichshafen in southern Germany. We just talked about it's a nice place down there at the lake. Check it out someday if you haven't already. Professor Soeffner covers a wide range of topics in his research. If you look him up, you will see that he did his PhD on 12th century Italian texts, very interesting texts, Decameron, and has also written a book about Game of Thrones, which, even though I haven't read it, I assume I can say safely that that's pretty cool. Today, Professor Soeffner is going to talk about Carl Schmitt, Corona and the state of emergency, and of course, anybody with a background in 20th century history or law or both can hear alarm bells ringing when the name Carl Schmitt is mentioned. And I'm very much looking forward to see now how much Professor Soeffner wants us to hear these alarm bells and how loudly they are ringing. But before I turn over to you, I'm giving the mic to Katharina with some technical aspects for the meeting. For example, she's going to mute you. So there you have already a little bit of an authoritarian structure.
Great. So welcome everyone. Now you are all very familiar with the Zoom meetings, right? And it's quite different from meeting in person because we always have also a technical moderator who can mute you all. I also would like to mention that this is a mutual event with the Haifa Center of German European Studies, but also with the Minerva Center for the Rules under Extreme Conditions. So we're very happy to do this together. Professor Soeffner will give his lecture of about half an hour, and afterwards we do a quick Q&A. If you have any questions in between, please type them in the chat, and I will afterwards moderate the discussion, namely reading the question or bundle them so we can have a very fruitful session. So I wish you all a very good meeting, and Jan, I hand over to you.
So it's just as a cultural theorist that I'm going to address a question about society, philosophy, and legislation. So please don't expect any expertise of me, which I will not be able to give you. All I can offer is what I would call contemplation. This might bring me into dangerous closeness to a form of protest that currently spreads through the German cities, even in small towns like the one where I live, Überlingen, at Lake Constance. The public meditations over the coronavirus and the measures. And so I wish to start my talk by contemplating over these meditations. The practice of protesting by silent meditation, which I also encountered in Überlingen, might recall Mahatma Gandhi. And this is even more true since the aim of this protest is to protect the fundamental rights of the citizens. Yet this kind of meditation is aimed at something by far less graspable than the mere executive power and violence Gandhi himself was facing. It doesn't even face any suppression, because it is protected by the very constitution the protesters believe to be threatened. How much German people, not only these meditators, fear for their rights can be intuited by a little anecdote. A friend of mine, who works as a legal counsel, a few days ago went out to walk his dog. There he encountered a neighbor, a kind, intelligent and well-educated, wealthy person, he told me, warning him that the smartphone app currently suggested by our government would collect a huge amount of data and then hand it over to enemy forces. My friend answered that this was not possible. Besides the public scandal, our legislation would immediately stop it. Didn't you know, the neighbor whispered in response, didn't you know that our constitution is abolished? The fear that a constitution could be threatened or even abolished without the majority of people even noticing says a lot about the current extent to which people experience to be controlled and surveyed during the corona measures. Indeed, here, as well as in the meditation, the enemy of the Constitution appears as something quite ungraspable, something existing only virtually, but therefore even more dangerous. Now, I don't want to make some easy jokes about conspiracy theories and their absurdities. I rather think that similar theories are most of all rationalizations of an existential mood that has taken hold of the German society. Most people indeed do not really believe in conspiracy theories, but many are concerned, and thus I would think that it is highly probable that the concerns are the driving force for the conspiracy theories and not vice versa. That doesn't mean, of course, that the concern is justified. At least in legal terms, it is certainly not. But when contemplating it, I think that it tells a lot both about current-day Germany and about its political situation during the corona crisis. First of all, it doesn't have to come as a surprise that an automatic response of German, and not only Germans, when faced with a state of emergency is to feel reminded of the Machtergreifung, the seizure of power by the Nazis. This response leads to a sense of obligation to denounce an executive power, presumably demolishing the state of the law and turning the country into a dictatorship. And this spontaneous response is most manifest, even if, as in the cases I told you about, this is most obviously not the case. Small wonder that this response then can lead to searching for a hidden usurper and to coming up with the weirdest theories about a totally virtual abolition of our constitution. Yet to say it again, most people do not actually believe in these theories, they rather feel simply concerned about the democracy and the state of the law. All of this makes for a pretty strange state of exception. And this paper is trying to theorize about this very new state of exception. Oops. Now, when pondering on states of exception, the authoritative theory was developed almost 100 years ago by the German legal philosopher Carl Schmitt. Schmitt made the state of exception the starting point of his political theology. The famous first sentence of his work reads, "Sovereign is who decides upon the state of exception." That means who or whatever is able to set and overrule the constitutional laws is thereby the sovereign. A reverse conclusion is that this theory suggests that states of emergency always tend to replace this state of the law by means of state of exceptions, and thereby they reveal an otherwise hidden true sovereignty. And in fact, Schmitt became a decisive thinker for the National Socialists who precisely used these means. This conclusion led the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben to broaden Schmitt's legal perspective in order to put forth a political theory of how, in democracy, a logic of sovereignty or dominance of the executive can be established. His example was the immediate aftermath of September 11th, the Patriot Act, the camp in Guantanamo Bay, and the Iraq War. In his book, State of Exception, he argued that by means of illegal laws that deprived the legislature of power, executive can take over sovereignty in quite a hidden way. Now, to be sure, the American democracy has not suffered from this state of exception as much as Agamben thought. Moreover, applying this theory to the corona crisis in Germany, it would be completely misleading, at least from a legal perspective. The corona regulations have never overridden the legal order, but rather reflect the normal balancing of goods between conflicting fundamental rights. However, I wish to grant Agamben's view as much. This very outbalancing of fundamental rights has only partially taken on the form of the usual democratic public exchange of opinions and interests. And moreover, some crucial principles and rights had been put into questions. The human necessity for a discrete burial, for example, one of the oldest things that has turned humans into human beings, or the right for family reunions. For these reasons, Agamben actually applied the Schmittian theory to the corona measures as well, and he did so as soon as in early February, calling the virus even fictitious. In the beginning, he stepped back from that position in the end, but he continued to denounce the governments to step beyond the democratic limits. The French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, however, immediately responded and opposed to such an application of an all too broad concept of the state of exception. Nancy reminded his old friend of the fact that the world is rather run by globalized networks, and that the biological virus as well as the viral media events were the real agents to which the governments only responded. They did not act as sovereigns, Nancy claimed, but rather followed the logic of a new state of exception that was no longer graspable in Schmittian terms. I think when holding a talk at Haifa University, I do not have to point out who Carl Schmitt was as a person and why any reference to him is not only political but also morally hard to accept. So I'm very inclined to follow Nancy's intuition that this might be a good occasion for dismantling him intellectually too. Indeed, in the face of the corona crisis, the Schmittian theory of the state of exception appears to be pretty outdated. Even in Agamben's reading, that would allow for the hidden overtakes of executive powers that then might translate in the sentiment that the people in the beginning, I talked about in the beginning, were following. And as seen there, even the German protesters were not able to identify the Schmittian sovereign, but rather responded to an ungraspable threat or needed to recur to absurd theories. And even in the unlikely event that they might have been right in assuming that the current measures are unjustified and excessive, their conclusion, which is consciously or unconsciously based on Schmitt, seems to be inadequate as well. The claim that voluntary submission of the executives to the knowledge of epidemiologists were in fact a hidden self-empowerment is almost as absurd as the assumption that the scientists were the puppets of dark forces waiting to control the world. Against this background, in my view, laying out a different theory of this new kind of state of exception is not just amusing on the paranoia of singular people. The threat, or at least the strangeness these people experience, is actually something real. And Agamben did a good job in describing it. The early weeks of the pandemic had created a kind of community that silenced the plurality of the German society. The establishment of rules and the huge agreement within this society to willingly follow them heavily reduced the amount of conflicting interests, opinions, inclinations, and struggles which are the lifeblood of democracies. This subjugation of democratic plurality to an abstract necessity proclaimed by scientists makes indeed think of a state of exception, even if it is still true that the very state of exception cannot be described by recurring to the legislation and moreover to recurring to the empowerment that Carl Schmitt talked about. The fundamental flaw of Schmitt's theory to describe this state of exception lies indeed in the concept of sovereignty, which, as seen, holds to be utterly inappropriate to describe the current situation. Sure, whoever tries to seek the sovereign might find one, but only due to an inclination to conspiracy theory. And what is worse, if too many people turn towards conspiracy theories, they might thereby create the illusion of sovereignty and thereby create sovereignty as such. Sovereignty, as in my view turns out to be no such thing as the hidden fundament of legislation Schmitt dreamt of. It is not the theological ground upon which the laws are grounded, manifesting itself in and by means of states of exception. Sovereignty appears to be rather a highly dangerous collective fiction that in certain situations tends to find the critical mass of followers, but doesn't have to. Similarly, the concept of a decision taken by the sovereign is often a fiction as well. States of exception can also simply emerge rather than being decided upon. And only conspiracy theorists believe that they are the consequence of decision taken. In order to thus develop a different approach to a state of exception, I wish to draw on the largely forgotten American essayist Randolph Bourne. Like Schmitt's political theology, his work, The State, was written as a direct reaction to the First World War, but from a completely different perspective. Bourne had experienced as an adolescent how, with the entry of the USA into the war, one impossibility followed the other. The flourishing globally intertwined economy was sacrificed in favor of a nationalist one. The proletarians of all countries did not unite, but shot each other to death. Humanitarian and humanistic science forgot itself and submitted to a goal that was actually foreign or alien to its aims. The democratic differences of interests and opinion disappeared, and the pluralistic society was transformed into a gigantic community, which he defined as the state, whose symbols, goals, and interests suddenly seemed to be sacred. In order to understand Bourne's approach, it must first be pointed out that he uses the word state in a pretty unusual way. State, in his view, is to be understood as an organization of a society that takes away its plurality. This definition led Bourne to suspect that the state was actually sick in peacetime and healthy only in wartime. Actually, the experience that drove Bourne to his theory shares some traits with what, on a much smaller scale, can be experienced in the early reactions to the corona pandemic as well. Indeed, I think it helps understanding that the executive did not have to use Schmittian sovereignty in order to heal the state, to use Bourne's word. Rather, the society had already morphed into a collective community, eagerly following the orders. What psychologists describe as the strong cooperation after a collective shock had set in, a little bit like the immense cooperation and communal feeling that caught New York in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Thus, I want to argue that this very morphing of plural society into disciplined communities in extreme situations is what might also decide upon a state of exception. And this kind of state of exception itself is what Bourne would call the health of the state. Bourne, due to his own experience, explained the statal recovery historically from the origin of statal structures from war alliances. But the corona pandemic tells a different story and allows for a broader interpretation. After all, states grew healthy in Bourne's sense of the word in the advent of the corona crisis by regulating public life in a way that was never thought to be possible before. Their rules extended into families and the body language of people, regulated travel, contact, meetings, and supermarket lines. And their regulations followed in an unchallenged way that pluralistic societies are not really used to the orders that have been given. In some, the state had become healthy in the Bournean sense of the word. When elaborating upon Bourne's theory against this backdrop, one might state that his state can also be understood as the very institution that knows that societies are not communities, but nevertheless strives to organize them as such. And this leads to an alternative definition of the state of exception. This alternative definition that my paper was aimed at. The state of exception, according to this view, would be the experience of a crisis that calls for organizing societies as if they were communities. Now, to be sure, this call and response can indeed take on the form of the belief in sovereignty and thus the empowerment of an executive, but it doesn't have to. It can also take on a different form. And this is what indeed happened in those states that, like Germany, developed the health of the state by rather recurring to the verdict of epidemiologists. How much this is still true in Germany could be witnessed only 2 days ago in the region I live in, Baden-Württemberg. Here it took less than 1 day from the publication of a new medical study stating that children spread the virus slower than thought, to the executive order of reopening the schools and abandoning the safety measures. The protests of working parents, caretakers, and teachers instead had been going on for months without leading to the slightest effect. The corona measures, moreover, have rather follow rather a question of organization than of sovereignty. Of structure and discourse than of decision. That makes think of Michel Foucault rather than Carl Schmitt. And indeed, the effects on everyday life have been quite reminiscent of Foucault's classic Discipline and Punish, the separation of bodies into spatial and temporal slots, the ordering of manners through individual distant rules, and also the greater surveillance reminders of the procedures that he described when he was describing a disciplinary society. And he did so as the attempt to rationalize society through organization, which might be described as the dark side of the Enlightenment in, I think, Foucault's view, and perhaps there is something to it. This observation, once more, is in strong contradiction with the rather romantic concept of sovereignty Schmitt has put forward. For Schmitt, the state of exception made sovereignty appear as something beyond the law and therefore able to establish new laws. It was therefore the irrational grounds for the rationality of laws. Foucault instead would argue for the mere effects of an order of discourse and institution. And I think that observing the corona measures, there is something to it. However, thus rationalized states of exception, the alliance between enlightenment and democracy might well turn out to be far more fragile than it might seem. Scientific reason, indeed, has to focus on the best argument rather than on the plurality of opinions and interests. The difference has already been pointed out very prominently by Plato, who also might be an unexpected forerunner of Bourne's essay, using, by the way, the same title, albeit in a different language, The State, the Republic, Politeia. What Bourne calls the inherent disease of the state indeed pretty much resembles the problem Plato addresses too. Like Bourne's sixth state, Plato's polis struggled with the fact that it had outgrown the size of a village that can be organized as a community. The polis thus requires politics, and therefore the state, the very institution that has to try to fill this organizational gap, in Plato's view, was sick, as long as it could not treat the society as a community. As you know, Plato therefore tried to recur to philosophy and rational laws, and maybe this might remind even of the situation that we have been facing too when we were recurring to sciences in order to organize the corona measures. Now, from Plato's own expedition to Syracuse on, all tentatives who had tried to establish such a state run by philosophers in the long run finished in a complete disaster. But actually, my paper is not about long-term solutions, but rather about states of exception. That is, it is about transitory states with a strong cooperation replacing the plurality of opinions. I think that it is important to consider this option and its problems and downsides also very carefully, since at this moment it appears to be rather attractive. Governments who refuse to lay their executive power into the hands of scientists have led their country into even worse situations than the countries that did it. Other arguably more serious crises are luring behind this one too. Global warming, military threats, social upheavals might call for the healing of a state in a similar way, or recurring to similar measures. Thus, periods of a rationalized state of exception, empowered by modern science, which in turn is empowered by digitalization, might slowly turn into kind of a new normal too. Despite the fact that alternatives might be worse in several situations, I'm not sure whether this would turn out to be a good thing. And therefore, I did not want to simply dismiss those German romantics who meditate about the measures and hoping for irrational revelations in the beginning. Who knows? Maybe they deserve better than just being made fun of. I thank you very much for listening.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jan, also for keeping the time. Maybe you can unshare your screen so we will see you.
Yes.
Great. And now it's the perfect time to type in questions. You can use the chat function that you have. And I will try to bundle them. Meanwhile, we're waiting for some questions. Maybe I take the opportunity of being also the moderator to get first on with the question. What I'm a bit trying to understand, and we talked about it before, right? How is the perception of Carl Schmitt at the moment in Germany? Because the state of exception is so widely discussed, right? And also other philosophers, also for example, Achille Mbembe, who was very highly discussed for being anti-Semitic in Germany in the last weeks, they built on this concept, right? So is there any kind of discussion in this direction? Do you feel this, or this is kind of outcast and everybody now focus of his concept of state of exception?
Well, I talked with this friend, this legal counsel, who told me that, to my surprise, in terms of legislation, Schmitt is just discussed as any other theoretician, even though there are evidently many scholars of law who do see that there is a problem, but in classes of universities, sometimes they just quote him. And but since I'm talking for cultural studies, I'm a little surprised actually how, on the one hand, if you compare the impact Schmitt had on National Socialism to the impact Heidegger had, that everybody talks about dismissing Heidegger, but Schmitt seems to be someone you can refer to somehow. And actually, I think Schmitt was, as a person and for the consequences, so much worse. It is really strange what is going on there. But nevertheless, everybody knows about the problematic issue there. But people like Agamben and others have done a great job in establishing him as a fixed point inside the discussion whenever it comes to discussing states of exception. Evidently, there are many other discourses about Schmitt around too, but I would suggest that it should be a good idea to talk a little less about him. And even though I did the opposite, I did so in order to pave the ground for discussing it a little less.
Great. I will open the mic for Stefan for a sec, because Stefan wants to phrase a question.
Yeah, and I also want to give us a little bit time to collect more questions in the meantime. You also already before we started this talk said, you know, now is the time to get rid of Carl Schmitt in our universities and our discussions. So basically two questions. You write for the Neue Zürcher Zeitung sometimes. Are you going to write an op-ed getting rid of Carl Schmitt? Are you working on getting rid of him? And the second one is...
Good idea. Perhaps I should do so.
I think you could. I have this feeling that, you know, in Germany we carry around a lot of, what do you say, people still, which are accepted in discourses which shouldn't be. Katharina is working on the political foundations, and I have a huge issue with Friedrich Naumann, who I think is somebody who justified genocide and should never be used in any context. But anyway,
you're right.
How do you explain that Carl Schmitt could gain such a currency? I understand, you know, that he was around in the English-speaking world, for example. You mentioned now Italy and France. I also could feel in English and American universities, you know, that he's being quoted and things. Was he re-imported to Germany, or was he always around?
This is hard to say. I think I can only ponder on this. I don't really have the data or something like that. But I guess there is some in cultural theory. He is a re-import. That's for sure. I don't think that in legal studies the same is true too. I think there he has simply been taken seriously as a legal philosopher. And as a re-import, I think how indeed the situation in the immediate aftermath after 9/11 and the ongoing anti-Americanism taking place there, and then the book of Agamben that was really published in the right years there, has done a great deal in order to re-establish Schmitt as a theoretical thinker to ponder on what was going on. I'm not trying to justify the Patriot Act or Guantanamo Bay, but if you read this book, you think, well, if you take this seriously and compare it to what really happened afterwards, you should simply admit that Agamben didn't really match the point already there. And now with the corona crisis, I think it's getting even worse, because actually Nancy was completely right about his opposition to Agamben's thought there. That, well, I don't know whether it really answers your question, but I think the problematic issue is, of course, that not all Nazis were stupid. And you cannot simply say that any idea that has been ever uttered by a Nazi should be taken off the list of being worth considering. So this is always the problem we have to face with these thinkers. But I think in the case of Carl Schmitt, this went far too far. So we really should think about getting rid about it. And maybe you're right about the idea.
Great. We have a first question from our postdoc, Dr. Elisa Bellotti, who is a historian, and it's also pointing in this way. She's interested in understanding if this concept of state of exception was applied also for past epidemics, like before Corona, and if it was formed in a discourse, maybe rather than in a decision.
This really gives me the great opportunity to talk about Boccaccio. Actually, thanks so much for this question. I would say that usually you wouldn't talk about a state of exception when you face pandemics. I think it is a part of what kind of humanism is around. The corona pandemic has always been compared to the Spanish flu, for example. But if you consider what people themselves were talking about after the First World War, it was not the pandemic, even though the pandemic had killed more people than the First World War had. So they considered, even Randolph Bourne, who died of the Spanish flu afterwards, only considered the First World War, and so did Dada movement and so on. So I think a state of exception has to do a lot about the discursive formation and the public opinion around that. So they wouldn't have called it this way. But turning to Boccaccio, that was actually the real emergence of a state of exception in a completely opposite way. Because even though medieval people tried to keep off the epidemic from their cities and used the same measures more or less we use today. They even used kind of mask. They had herbs to refresh the air. They knew that the contagion could come from the air. They called it miasma and so on. And they had quarantine measures, and they had everything that today we have too. They also locked down people inside their houses, and people were avoiding each other. But nevertheless, the order completely collapsed. It is the opposite of what happened there. And actually, what Boccaccio ponders on is the ability of humans to, against this background, create their own rules and their new humanity, because every pandemic, in a way, questions the humanity of humans. Because every pandemic has the problem of burial, which is essential to being human. And every pandemic reduces human beings to being treated like animals in a way, because they die like animals. And so you use, even nowadays, you use measures that have been tested on animals, and that it is more or less the same measure that you would use too if you have a flock of animals and some are infected. You would use the same measures. So every epidemic raised the question about what makes humans human. And Boccaccio's answer was that it was, on the one hand, compassion, but compassion not in terms of just helping each other, but feeling with each other, also through narrative. So narrative reorganization of humanity according to certain rules would have been his reply there. And there I would see something like a virtual state of exception and the measures taken there, not by sovereignty but by storytelling would have been his answer.
Great. We have another question from Jan Kühne, and afterwards we hand over to Professor Salzberger. And he's interested in how far, like, our shift to a virtual reality caused an influence of how we measure this pandemic, and how does it influence this concept of state of crisis or exception that we have now.
Absolutely, great question, because I think when pondering about the conspiracy theories that are most prominent, you find the conspiracy theory about Bill Gates at the most prominent level there. And given the absurdity of this theory, you might ponder upon why Bill Gates actually, and why not the 10,000 other options that you would have had. And I think Bill Gates is the very icon of the success of during the 1990s of our new digitalized virtual existence. And actually, at the same time, we have, as Nancy pointed out, the viral activities going on in the computers as well. So information can follow the rules of viral contagion in a way, and we are driven back by this virus towards computer screens, as we're now in this very situation. So on a illogical but just felt rationality, it makes perfect sense that you choose Bill Gates. And so I think in this very kind of state of exception, you're completely right that we have to take this virtuality into consideration, even in terms of we are led by virtual forces that we cannot grasp, because this is actually what the digital revolution has brought about. Our everyday lives are controlled by smartphones, and you don't even need the secret services to do so, or the companies like Apple or Google. You just follow the logic that is no longer yours in a way, and so it is easy to think of the absurdity of abolishing a constitution by merely virtual means, and nobody notices because it is hidden somewhere. So again, it is not logical, but it is a felt rationality behind that has to be taken seriously in terms of the problems people face, not in the terms of the solutions they might argue for.
Okay, good. Ilya, I will hand over to you. Maybe you have more a legal perspective.
Not necessarily legal perspective, but Jan, first, thank you for this wonderful talk, inspiring talk. We are in a global state of exception or state of extreme situation. And I think that the most interesting conclusion is the differences.
Yes.
Between different governments, different society, different culture, which actually collapse all the theories. Because, Carl Schmitt is very present in Hungary. Okay? In Hungary, it was exactly the prescription of Carl Schmitt. If you look at Brazil,
yes.
I gave a talk in Brazil a few days ago. Their inaction of the federal government prompts people and organization to go to court to call for the government to close down, to regulate, to make social distancing. So it's exactly the opposite of what we are saying, governments are actually regulating our life too much. There's also a very interesting difference in disobedience or obedience to the orders. I read a very nice piece in the New York Times a few days ago about the reporter in Berlin who says, for many Germans, it's really a great revival because we have so many rules and regulations to follow and we can comment to others when they don't.
Exactly. This is
in Israel, the virus or the management of the crisis was initially very good. We have actually quite good results. But now the real character of Israeli people who disobey orders brings into a new surge in the virus. And it's certainly not Carl Schmitt who dominates what we are seeing in the Israeli scene. So it's interesting, and I think that the interesting lessons from this crisis will be to compare and to try to construct new axes of identifying or characterizing different societies, political cultures, governments, and so forth.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you're absolutely right about that. I was talking about more or less Germany only, and but of course, those people who think in Schmittian terms are a real danger to their given societies, and this is actually, I think, the examples you gave, especially Bolsonaro, is a real threat to democracy, by far worse than the little threat that I was talking about in the end. But you haven't mentioned China, which I would have thought of as the most interesting example of how things can go, because actually they seem to establish a kind of sovereignty on the one hand, that on the other hand fakes to be mere rationality. And using the social credit system, they also try to establish such a system that is more the attempt to more rationalize their society in a way that would take place in the long-term solution, and not only in the state of exception solution. And I think this to be a very interesting approach too, because I think it is much more future-directed, like personalities like Bolsonaro, which I would think I would give him perhaps another 5 years, maybe he will immediately be removed. But if he goes on like this, I don't think that he will be able to succeed for a long time. Whereas with the Chinese government, I think we face a different story. It might actually work what they're doing.
We didn't mention the U.S. and Trump.
Both of us didn't mention the U.S. but the U.S. I'm pretty sure that actually in the U.S. the democratic structures in terms of the society are strong enough. The legal and the societal democratic structures are strong enough, and I think this is. We will perhaps we might have to talk again in November, but as far as I would think now, I think the problem is already heading to a good solution, heading towards a good solution.
I'm envious about your optimism.
We have another interesting question again from Dr. Bellotti, and I think we also didn't touch this yet, fitting in conspiracy theory, and she would like to know like how this whole anti-vaccine movement fits into this current state of exception.
Well, there are several answers. Of course, there is the answer that the Bill Gates answer. There's conspiracy theory, and I think computer viruses play a role in this conspiracy theory as well. So it is not in logical terms, not in terms of argumentation, but in terms of the fear of Bill Gates. But taking on a German perspective now again, I think especially in the region where I live in, and during Corona times you cannot travel very much, so I observed that particular part of Germany very closely. We have a huge community of the so-called anthroposophical movement, Anthroposophen, and actually usually, even though there had been some affinities during the Nazi periods between this movement and the Nazis, nowadays you couldn't really call it this way any longer. They are rather green than anything else, and they have taken serious measure to distance themselves from this particular past they have. So I wouldn't consider them in usual times as a political threat. but they are in extreme opposition against all kinds of vaccinations. There was even before, even in the first weeks of the corona pandemic, when everybody was, as you said, happy to finally follow the rules, there were so many people of whom I would never have expected that in Germany, who felt so relieved in a way that finally everybody was doing the same thing. And already at that point, in this particular moment, there was already a manifestation going on here at the very marketplace in front of which I'm living, and it was really a fun thing, because nobody really seemed to know what they really were against, but they. The local newspaper made a summary of that and called it man-virus world. That is the connection with nature and the world, and the virus is part of it. And so we should not follow vaccination and not follow the restrictions, but rather hand ourselves over to the ongoing of nature and the virus and so on. And I think this kind of green movement that opposes vaccination in Germany is stronger than one might think, even though it might also be a thing to make fun of. Nevertheless, even them, I like these people actually, in a way. In their way, I'm not part of them, but I like them.
Very good. So, are there any urgent last questions? If not, we're going to wrap up. And I think what you said in the end, it's also very much fitting into Carl Schmitt's concept, right, of defining politics, like define your friend, define your enemy, and there's just politics as long as there's a conflict going on, and this is what makes politics important. So thank you very much, Jan, for joining us. As we said, next year in Haifa, not in Jerusalem, but in Haifa. And thanks also to the Minerva team and to Eli for joining and doing this co-event. And yeah, we wish you all a lot of health and hope to see you next year in Haifa. The event is recorded, so you can re-see it or re-watch it on our both Facebook accounts on Minerva and Haifa. So I wish you all a very lovely weekend.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much that I could be here.